Hi Cherry Pies, thank you so much for joining me for this video. I would like to thank my patrons, and specifically today I would like to thank my doll faces and Pop Tarts over on Patreon for bringing us today's video topic. Every single month over on Patreon, my doll faces and Pop Tarts have an opportunity to vote for a video that they would like to see uploaded onto my channel. And so every month I hopefully offer 3 or 4 really juicy, interesting topics, and they choose which one they would like. This month they have decided that they would like to know about my most difficult shadow work experiences. So before I go ahead and dive right in, because inevitably as a long-term veteran shadow chaser myself, I have a lot to talk about here. But before I get into it, I just want to state that shadow work is sort of a practical offshoot. It's a conversation that involves a bunch of techniques, a bunch of theories, and it's based around Carl Jung's theory of the shadow in human psychology, which is basically the parts of our psyche that we do not want to accept, that we have chosen to deny, that we do not want to associate with our sense of self. So basically the shadow is the basement where we put things that we do not want to acknowledge, we do not really want to identify with ourselves, and yet those things may come out in our beliefs, in our behaviors, in the choices that we make. Shadow work is this idea that we, when we come across something from the shadow, when we are confronted or presented with something that is from the shadow side of our psyche, where we have put things that we do not want to deal with or that we do not want to identify with, we have the opportunity to sit down with that content and actually to try and work on it in a conscious way, to understand where it comes from and to integrate it into our understanding of who we are, so that it no longer has control over our actions and decisions. So it's kind of this idea that whatever you suppress will predominate, whatever you resist will persist, and that if you are confronted with shadow, or if you do know that there are certain parts of shadow content that you've seen glimpses of, or you've kind of somewhat seen it rise to the surface before, then it's something you are at least partly conscious of. So if you feel brave enough to work on it and you know that it's causing issues for you in your life or for your loved ones, shadow work is basically what we call the process of working on that content. If you want to learn more about it, I used to say check out my playlist, but quite honestly, everybody talks about shadow work on a lot, well, not everybody, but it's a very, very big thing now. You will find lots of videos on shadow work, so you do not have to choose to watch my shadow work playlist if you want to learn more about it. However, I do have one, so I will leave the link to my shadow work playlist down below, because I've been talking about shadow work online now since 2012, so there's quite a bit of material there for you if you would like my take on things. Oh, blimey, I've really got a lot of energy today for this. I'm wearing my Midsummer t-shirt. I think that's quite appropriate actually for the topic for today, because it's quite a shadowy film. Let me know down below if you love Midsummer as much as I do. I think it's an absolutely genius film, but I know people have some very strong feelings on it, so if you want to let me know what you think, leave your opinions down below. I got this amazing t-shirt from a creator on Redbubble. It is incredible. I will leave the link to that t-shirt down below. Non-spawn, it's just for anybody who might also be a big fan and might want to see this t-shirt up close, because the design is incredible. Okay, with all that being said, I have got a gigantic list here of things that I want to talk about. Some of the things in this video, darlings, are things that are very specific to my journey. They are themes that come up in my shadow work. They are things that I have really worked very hard to deal with, things that have been persistent, things that have been very difficult for me as an individual. Other points that are on this list are things I more generally feel about whatever I might be shadow working. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my story, where I've been, what kinds of things have been difficult for me to work through, but then also I'm going to talk about just what is difficult about anything that I might be shadow working, the things I've come up against that have been challenges. I'm going to leave some timestamps in the comments, darlings, and also in the description bar, so you can jump around. You can do a house of pain if you should so choose. I've done a lot of shadow work. I've done a lot of shadow work in my time, and the first thing that came to mind when I started thinking about the most difficult themes that I have processed in shadow work, number one right at the top when I was thinking about it, was family estrangement, and the way that I connect my family with my sense of identity, and how that obviously had to change. The parameters of that had to change when I started to pull away from my family. I didn't identify with the behaviors that were occurring in my family. I had several big family splits, and I now no longer consider myself to be a hugely family oriented person in many ways at all. There are certain key members of my close family that I do speak with and I do enjoy having a relationship with, and we do see each other sometimes, but there's a whole side of my family that I now have nothing to do with. I do not speak to them, and I haven't for years. And that was something that obviously, as you can imagine, came through a lot in my shadow work. I had to reform large parts of my identity, because with both sides of my family, I'm not really connected very closely to the wider family. But with one side of my family, I'm completely estranged now. I'm really just totally cut off from that side of the family. But with certainly both sides of my family, my mum's and my dad's, I know that from speaking to loads of other people, personally and professionally over the years, I know that with my family unit on both sides, there's a really strong type of personality, a really strong set of characteristics on both sides, just a very strong sense of what the family vibe is, what the dynamics are, what the sense of humor is like. And certainly on one side of my family in particular, what the politics were, and how we thought about life, and how we thought about ethics, and how we thought about religion, and the history of our family and the oppression of our people, and all of that jazz. So lots and lots of things going on there that, as you can imagine, massively contributed to who I am as a person. So when you recognize that there is sort of high levels of toxicity in your family setups, when you recognize that you're dealing with a lot of multi-generational trauma, you're dealing with a feeling that you need to separate yourself from dynamics that are really having a very, very negative impact on you and corroding your well-being. When you realize those things, but you also come from these very strong, very distinctive family lines with big personalities, and could be quite easily described, the characteristics of both of these families, you really do find that your identity sort of goes through the meat grinder. And that really did happen with me. And I had to shadow work that a lot. I had to do a lot of surrendering. I had to do a lot of, and by surrendering, what I mean by that is a lot of my shadow work around this. And I could make a totally separate video on this, darlings. It's quite a big topic, and I have made a couple of videos on family estrangement and boundaries with family and changing relationships with your family. I will leave both of those videos down below if you feel they would be of use to you. They do draw heavily on my experiences. But what I mean by surrendering is I had to let go. I had to let go of all these things that I built up about my beliefs about myself and about how my connection to my family sort of contributed so hugely to who I am as a human being. And of course that's true, but it couldn't continue to be true. It could be true in the roots of me, but no longer in the branches. And for anybody who has estranged themselves from family, who doesn't speak to key close family members anymore, who really has had to connect more with chosen family than with blood family, any of those things, if you've experienced any of those things, you will, I think, at least in part understand what I mean by having to acknowledge and accept the way your blood family experiences live in your roots, the roots of who you are, but you have to grieve and surrender when you think about the fact that that influence can't come with you into the branches. You have decided that isn't right for you, or maybe they've decided that they don't want to continue on into your branches, into the growth, into the momentum forward of who you're going to be. And that can be a massive loss. It can be incredibly scary. So that's definitely one of the most difficult things that I have come across in my shadow work experiences. I'm going to be definitely offering people a lot more insight into my own experiences there and just talking about things that have helped me. But as I said, I've done a couple of videos on it. I'll leave them down below for you. Another really difficult experience for me in my shadow work is the amount of times that I retroactively shadow worked something that I had already gone through and already kind of dealt with and already drawn conclusions on. But it was when I didn't have a lot of the psycho-spiritual tools and resources that I had later on. So for example, I did not really know much about the human shadow or connect with the term shadow work yet when I went through my experiences with psychosis, which happened between the ages of 14 and 21. The majority of that and the impact of that. So at the time, I dealt with it in the ways I had to deal with it. I thought of it in the way I thought of it. And I didn't have access to all this other stuff. I wasn't practicing my spirituality very actively between those times. That was around the time when I was very off again, on again with the craft and really not really understanding my spiritual identity that much. So basically what happened was I used the tools that I had. I used the sort of blunt instruments that I had available to me. And later on, when I started doing shadow work, of course, these things would come up. My memories of my psychosis, my memories of my suicide attempt, my memories of my very, very deep depression and my years of self-harming. All of these things came up and I retroactively shadow worked them, which can be difficult because you experience such strong memories of what you went through and what your thoughts were at that time and, you know, all that kind of thing. But you're not going through that anymore. And you already did a lot of very hard work to come to the point with a lot of these things where you've either dealt with them and they're no longer a factor, or as in the case of my mental health struggles, you've got all of these sort of systems in place that the sort of reduce the impact of those things when they come up. So to sort of have access to these really strong memories of what happened before and to put those memories through the shadow work filter really was difficult for me. It had to be done. It was something that I did automatically. It was something that as I leaned into shadow work in my mid to late 20s, really seriously, of course, these things came up. My memories of my mental health issues, my memories of difficult times growing up, difficult family experiences, they came up for me. But I was shadow working them retroactively, meaning they weren't really a high priority in terms of what was affecting me negatively at the time I started shadow working them. They'd already been dealt with. And to be honest, with some areas of that, I felt like I'd already experienced a lot of healing before I started shadow working those things. For example, with my self-harm, I'd already not been self-harming for quite some years before I shadow worked my relationship with self-harm, because I stopped self-harming and I went through the fallout from that and the healing from that and everything else. Then later I found shadow work and everything that could give me. And so I looked back on my self-harm experience, but it was from quite a way away. I'd already stopped for quite a while before I shadow worked it, if that makes sense. So there have been quite a few times where I've felt called to retroactively approach something in shadow work. That's definitely difficult. And one of the main ways that I dealt with that was, and this is something that I often say to people when they want to do shadow work or they're struggling with shadow work, don't be afraid to just take your foot off the gas, leave something. If you feel like you're on a hamster wheel and you feel like you keep looking at the same memory or assessing the same prior issue and you're going nowhere with it, sometimes you just have to accept that you've gone as far as you can with shadow working something that you no longer have any dominion over, that's already kind of been put to bed and there's nothing really further that can be done about it externally. It's just a bunch of memories and a bunch of obviously deep influences that have affected you. And of course, we shadow work those things, but I think we also need to understand our limits with shadow working those things and that it's okay to just recognize those things had an effect. Maybe there are other answers that I want, or there is a sense of peace that I want to get to, but maybe it will come at another point. Maybe it will come at another time for me. Maybe I don't need to be too overtly ambitious about pushing for it now. I think quite a few of you will probably be able to relate to the next thing that I'm going to say. And that is that sometimes it's hard for me to understand if some of the motivations that I have and the goals that I have are connected to my previously disordered thoughts and motivations from the past. So it's kind of carrying on from the previous point I made, I suppose, in that sometimes it can be difficult when you know that you had these things going on in your past and they have not really traveled with you to the current point on your journey, but you're always aware that they could come back up. For example, this is a big example for me. This is something that I have shadow worked a few times just to make sure that everything's okay and that my processes are okay. but I have had experiences with disordered eating, with food restriction and obsession with weight and numbers and that kind of thing. I no longer weigh myself. I feel I have a reasonably healthy relationship with food. Every so often, every sort of, I don't know, twice a year or something like that, I might find that, like, if I've dipped into a depressive episode, I start finding that it's connected to what I'm doing with food. But it's so easy to identify that now and to put measures in place. I really don't think that my relationship with food is an issue, and has not been for a long time. However, my motivations with exercise and with healthy eating and, you know, the physical movement piece, I know a lot of you guys know I'm really into that. I'm into my Pilates. I love going to the gym. I really, really miss the gym. Oh my goddess, I can't wait to get back to the gym. So I love being embodied, and I love sweating, and I love working out. And I do have some aesthetic goals as well as stamina goals, mental health goals, those kinds of things. I have challenges that I want to put into place with my weightlifting, with my Pilates. I'm always enjoying to push myself. Now, aesthetic goals are part of it for me. I know they're not part of it for everybody, but I really enjoy having some visible evidence that what I'm doing is paying off. And I've shadow worked a couple of times my connection between the aesthetic goals and whether or not that's truly always healthy. Fortunately, I have found that my conclusion comes down on the side of, like, you know what, I'm somebody who is excited by physical changes that show that I have been consistent with what I'm doing, and I like that for myself. I've always been very careful not to be overt about that on my Instagram or my Facebook, or, like, I never make a big deal out of the way that my look is changing from exercise. If I'm going to tell people I'm exercising, it's going to be more along the lines of, like, showing my Pilates mat and my weights or whatever. I've done that once, or I've shown a picture of the gym dressing room with my stuff there and been like, I smashed the gym. But I'm never going to say, oh my god, look at my abs popping through, or I love my biceps today, or anything. I make a point of never saying anything like that. That's not a part of what I want to put out there necessarily. And I don't think there's anything wrong with people who do have fitness channels or whatever talking about how to achieve certain aesthetic goals. That's fine. But because I know that with my audience, I myself have previously been disordered, and a lot of members of my audience also have taken aesthetic goals to a really, really shadowy place, I want to make sure I don't place too much emphasis on it. And I've also really had to work to make sure that having aesthetic goals is actually okay for me, and that it's not something that's gone into a bit of dodgy territory there. It's quite hard sometimes with that kind of thing, you know, baby cakes, because you have to land where you land with your conclusion. So if somebody comes to you, a friend or loved one of yours, and they say to you, and this has not happened to me, by the way, but it's just an example. If someone comes to you and they say, look, I'm not being funny, but I think you're really falling into disordered eating or disordered thinking, or you're going back to a previous negative cycle that you had that you have gotten over, and I don't want to see you go back to it. If that person loves you and they know you, you're going to probably listen to that. You might be in denial when they first mention it, and you might be angry or defensive, but really it's highly likely that you're going to go away and think, okay, do they have a point? Because maybe they're seeing something that I'm not seeing about what's happening here, and maybe I am being unhealthy. And certainly I try to take on board when somebody says I'm not being healthy with anything. And like, I have friends who love me, who have said to me, like, Kellyanne, you know, I'm worried about you in this regard, or I'm worried about you in that regard, especially overworking or partying too much. A couple of times in my last 10 years of my life, I've had friends just be like, hey, you know, you seem tired. You seem like you need to, you know, just sort of regroup and plan to, you know, you're overgiving or whatever it might be. You're smashing the hinges off it too hard, Kellyanne. I burn the candle at both ends, and if there was a third end, I'd be burning it there too. You know what I mean? I'm very zesty. I'm full Sagittarius all the time. And yeah, so my friends have said things like, Kellyanne, are you okay? Or, you know, just concerned about you, darling. And of course, I've said that to my friends in return. That's what friendship's all about. But I think when your friends come to you and they say something's cropping back up, or you're not recognizing that you're thinking in a disordered way, or you're doing something that isn't healthy, you have to take that into consideration if you know that they know you and they're just concerned for you. But really, if you're not prepared to take it to your heart, if you don't really want to believe it yourself, you're not going to take it to a place of figuring it out, shadow working through it, taking responsibility for it. And in the same way, if you know that something potentially shadowy might be going on, but nobody else has clocked it, none of your friends or family or your partner or whatever, nobody's noticed it, nobody's said anything, but you know that you might need to just check to make sure, you might decide, oh, well, no one's noticed anything, no one's said anything, let me carry on, let me just continue with the behavior. And so this is really about getting honest with yourself, isn't it? It's about going right down to the bottom line and saying, is this something that's in shadow or not? Is this an issue that I'm really trying hard not to see, but maybe I can just see it breaching and I know that it's there. And if so, you have to do something about it. So sometimes things like that have been hard for me. Other motivations, like I can be very ambitious, I can be very creatively ambitious, I can be I can have cycles of real productivity. And I want to make sure that that isn't connected to motivations that are to do with like toxic comparison, feeling like I need to hustle for my worthiness, that kind of thing. So I want to make sure that those motivations are not at play when I'm being very productive, very proactive, very go-getting. I want to make sure that the motivations there are as they should be and not in shadow. So again, I'm examining and I'm thinking, okay, let me just slow down for a second and make sure that I'm doing this for the right reasons and I feel okay about it. And in the same way as well, I'm a recovering overgiver. And I'm really working very much with boundaries and with the underlying motivations for overgiving and coming to understand what they are. It's really interesting. I'm doing a lot of reading at the moment on that and have been for the last year. It's been one of the major things I've been working on in my therapy. And it's been so interesting because I've helped so many people with this. And now it's great to be able to put that microscope onto myself and recognize where that's coming up for me in the last few years and deal with it. However, obviously now it's created this dialogue for me where when I am in giving mode, I just want to check that everything's okay and that I'm not going back into those previous shadow behaviors. So it's just checking motivations, basically. I suppose it doesn't sound like too much of a difficult thing, but for me, it can be quite weird because ultimately it's my decision, just like ultimately it's anyone's decision. You have the last word on whether or not something is in shadow for you. And even if 10 people are telling you you're overgiving, you don't have a healthy relationship with food, you're not coping healthily with this or whatever, you have to be the one to say, okay, I cop to it. Okay, something needs to change. And if you don't have that reaction, you have to know that's okay. You have to know that you veto somebody else's concern, or you have to know that you did your inventory, you checked whether or not something was in shadow, and you really feel that it's not, in the way that I did with my wanting to have some aesthetic goals in my exercise, my physical movement, that whole exploration of embodiment through physical movement, through physical exertion. I have to know that it's okay for me to have some aesthetic goals and to be excited by aesthetic changes without it leading to me being unhealthy, disordered, restricting food, comparing myself, because I really don't want to go down that road. I've worked very, very hard for a long time to make sure I'm on track and I'm healthy in that regard. And so the last thing I would want is to let motivations that I have go under the radar, go unchecked, and eventually end up leading me to a point where I'm struggling with an ED again or something like that. So I have to be very cognizant of that, and I have to check it against my little shadow chart all the time. Well, not all the time, but as often as is necessary. Oh, blimey, I'm becoming a bit of a coffee addict, a milky, sugary coffee addict, and I'm not sorry. I think my business journey has definitely been an area where quite a lot of shadow work has had to be done. I have shadow worked issues around exposure, having a public platform, being the face of a brand, delivering a message, a bunch of things that are really important to me, a bunch of memories, a bunch of information about issues I've been through. There's a lot of vulnerability there, and I have had to shadow work what is sacred vulnerability and what is high risk vulnerability that is not okay and that is not necessary. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, darlings, in the Afterthoughts episode that is going to be available over on Patreon, that is going to be connected to this episode. So if you want to get more into that with me, you can certainly become a patron, or if you are a patron, hop on over there. I've got more thoughts on that. But yeah, whenever you have a public platform, you're dealing with sometimes shadows around self-image, sometimes sometimes shadows around imposter syndrome, sometimes there's toxic comparison stuff. And as I said, just shadow working, what is an acceptable amount of vulnerability, what is an acceptable way to make sure my boundaries are firm and I protect myself when weird things happen, which weird things always happen if you have a public platform. Every so often shit just gets out of hand. It all gets a little bit midsummer up in this bitch. So you just have to know that you are very comfortable with the way that you are expressing yourself and the way that you give yourself permission to pull back, pull up the drawbridge, do what you've got to do to set boundaries if that needs to be done. With having an online platform, there are so many times that you will receive some really harsh criticism. I don't mind being critiqued. I don't mind somebody having a contrary opinion, but I'm talking about shitty criticism. Like, you used to be so great and now you're a boring bitch or whatever, you know, just something that's unnecessary, doesn't need to be said, and is just designed really to bring you down or whatever. Or somebody saying that you don't know anything, you're an airhead, you bring nothing to the conversation. It's not really criticism, it's just negativity, like for no reason, for no apparent reason. You can receive some of that and it really will, well, in my case anyway, let me just speak for me. I can receive something like that and it really just has no effect on me. I mean, it's something that I expect with a public platform, that every so often something's going to come at me and it's not going to be pleasant. And, you know, it's either going to be from somebody who used to enjoy my work and is now complaining about something I'm saying that they don't agree with and they are really being harsh about it, or it's going to be someone who literally came to troll me, to try and pull me down, to try and upset me in some way. Sometimes it's really twisted stuff. A couple of months ago, I got such a weird email from somebody telling me graphically how they wanted me to try and kill myself. It was really off. So, you know, it comes with the territory. It's a very small percentage of times that things come through to me that are unpleasant or weird. And I really want to make that clear. Like, I'm lucky enough to be able to do YouTube lives where I don't even need anyone to moderate. I mean, literally, there's just no weirdness in the comment section. It's everybody's okay and it's all kind of a nice vibe. So I'm very lucky in that regard. But with the size of public platform that I have, which is still, you know, comparatively small, but with the size that it is, yes, I'm going to get some people that are trying to hurt me. And as I said, a lot of the time, that's not going to do anything to me. I expect it. It comes with the territory. I think of myself as a very self-confident, very self-assured person. And I've done a lot of work, some of it shadow work, no less, to get to that point. But every so often, somebody will say something and it's not even so much always what they say, it's just where I am when it is delivered to me. So I might already be in a weird, crappy mood. I might already feel like there's stuff going on in my life that I'm dealing with. It might be something that's connected to the theme that the hate comment has tapped into. But basically, sometimes that really does go to a dark place. And I'm like, oh, that's not nice. I will need to sit with that. And I'm not saying I sit there and I do whole sessions of shadow work on it, but I might need to go in and have a tinker. You know what I mean? I might just have to do a little bit of shadow maintenance there because something will just sort of catch me off guard. And I'll be like, okay, that was unpleasant and uncalled for. And it's definitely taken me to this place where I don't really want to be. So, but, you know, it's so rare. I thought I'd mention it though, because it's a weird thing that I think a lot of people, you know, that obviously don't have to go through. It's they're not exposing their thoughts, memories, feelings, self-image to an ongoing and growing audience. They're not doing that. So because that's a part of my reality that I also deal with, of course, sometimes there are opportunities for shadow work and reflection that come from that. Something I've shadow worked that has been so difficult is a very small handful of connections in my life that ended. Obviously, the pain of those connections ending and sometimes the reasons for those connections ending. But I found that the thing that groups them all together underneath this shadow umbrella is the conduct of the other person when the connection ended. I feel like it took me a lot less time to shadow work the pain of the ending, the sort of circumstances of the ending, because I do acknowledge that not everything is forever. Not every connection, not every friendship is forever. Some people come to you for a season, not a lifetime, and all that good fucking jazz. I know that. So that takes less time. What ended up taking significantly more time for me, and what was much more difficult, is just being cut off, being ghosted, not being given the courtesy or the civility of just even a dignified ending. I don't want to give the impression that this is something that I have dealt with loads, because I certainly haven't at all. I am not saying that I've got this string of people that have just cut me out, cut me off, ghosted me, not really given me an explanation for what has happened or why they don't want to sort it out, when even with one situation I really feel it was extremely rectifiable, with just some mature adult interaction, just some conversation to fix what I honoured as a very important friendship, and that I know the other person saw as a close connection. So it was quite baffling. So you know, the thing about that is that you can end up, even if it only happens to you a very small handful of times, you can end up taking it to a place where you've decided that it means something about how much you're worth, and it means something about how much the friendship or the connection, whatever, really meant to the other person. So I just, the few times this has happened to me, it's happened to me 3 times in my life. It has, well, twice actually. And then there was one time where there was somewhat of a dialogue, but I characterize it in the same thing anyway. It's really hard doing this video. I'm like really taking you into my shadow terrain, but also not at the same time. So it's hard to know if I'm giving too much detail or whatever. But basically, I took those experiences to an extremely difficult place where, first of all, I took it to a place that was about my worth as a human being, and was about my apparent gross misjudgment of the other person and their capability to have anything like the caliber of connection that I expect and that I thought we were having. There's been a lot of anger, a lot of recurring anger around the way I was treated. And so when I wasn't blaming myself for it utterly and telling myself that it had something to do with how much I'm worth as a human being, I was taking probably very little to no responsibility for my part in any of it at all, because I was too busy full on demonizing the other person, like thinking of them ultimately as just fucking a terrible person for ending it the way they did. So I had to find this sort of middle ground. It's very hard. I found that to be a really difficult experience in shadow work for me, and I have had to sit with that. I remember when it first happened to me years ago in my 20s with this girl, this woman I'd been best friends with for like 6 years, and a series of things happened, but I basically just had to call her on some bad behaviour. And when I say bad behaviour, chickens, I mean really just out of control, indiscriminate, everyday addicted drug use that she was in denial about, and animal abuse, really, animal neglect. She was neglecting to feed her pet and change her pet's litter and look after her pet, and her pet was underweight and like, you know, was shitting on the floor because their litter needed changing. And my partner and I had taken over these duties, and I tried to say to her, like, look, why don't you give my partner and I the cat? It's okay if you can't handle the responsibility, but we can't leave the cat here when we move, because without us here, without us doing these things aren't getting done, even though we've talked about it previously. Honestly, like the day we left, she wouldn't give us the cat. She said, no, I want to step up, own my responsibility. There was also a lot of mess when I was living with her because of the fact that she just couldn't handle the amount of consumption of, I think there was a laziness issue anyway, but there was also the consumption of drugs was just getting to the point where it was too much for her to be able to really take care of her part of chores and stuff. As you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, you're so best off out of this friendship, and amen to that. But it wasn't always this way, you understand, but it escalated into these issues. And the reason I'm telling you these details is to explain that I think the reason she cut me off without ever speaking to me again after I moved out of the house is largely because of shame. I think she was ashamed, and it also came to light after we moved out that she had stolen money from me. That was supposed to go to her mother, who was my landlady, and she pocketed the money for herself. And then her mother thought that I just hadn't paid rent. So a lot of stuff going on, which really you would think, why did you need to shadow work that, Kellyanne? Clearly she was just operating from a place of being ashamed and not wanting to ever talk about these things again. And so basically having to cut you off because she behaved so terribly. And, you know, I do give her a lot of accountability now for what happened, because I was trying to talk to her lovingly about the pet and the flat and her brain and what was happening. And she rejected that and rejected me completely and never, just wouldn't answer my messages, just acted like I didn't exist. It cut me out entirely, which was absolutely awful for me. It was absolutely terrible. I was so devastated. And I remember just going through so many feelings about, like, what was that friendship? What happened at the end there? How did I become the villain? How did that person think it was okay to just freeze me the fuck out and not talk to me at all? I can't remember what I was going to say about I remember when it happened. I remember when it happened anyway. I had a lot to unpack with that. Oh yeah, what I was going to say was, that led to my other extremely close friend, who was, I would say, equally close to both of us, if not slightly closer to me, basically just sort of going over to her side and not really interacting with me as much anymore. And sort of making plans with this woman who'd done this to me, but not consciously not making plans with me and breaking plans with me. And it was just painful. It was horrible to see that she wasn't going to be able to maintain an equal relationship with both of us if we weren't friends anymore. She was going to go to that other woman. She didn't want to maintain the friendship with me. And that was really, really hurtful. I went through so much with that. That was really one of the most difficult periods of shadow work since retroactively shadow working the most tough, dark times in my life, right? So yeah, there was a lot to unpack there with that. And I remember a year and a half after that happened, after both of those women stopped speaking to me, I had to go through a big time of spiritual work and shadow work because I still wasn't over it. I realized I still wasn't over it, and I had to do this massive ritual. I did a 3-day fast. I did all this deep spiritual work. I did readings. I did these massive long readings about my connections with both of these women and my connection with myself and like how I can get through this. I spoke with Goddess about it at length. I called in all these messages and all this strength because I realized I still wasn't over it. It hurt me so deeply. And that has been echoed very recently. A lot of memories have been brought back up of that, of the feeling of investing so much into a connection and knowing that it's not perfect, because no connection is perfect. No, nobody behaves impeccably all the time. On either side at all. And I would never say that I'm perfect or that I don't have anything to look at. But the idea that instead of hashing it out, sorting it out, or at least just putting a pin in it until we can sort it out, the idea that this person just cut me the fuck off, like has never messaged me since. It's just baffling. I mean, we didn't even have a full conversation about what the issues were. We didn't, like, literally this person just asked me to leave, and I didn't even get my day in court, if you will. Nothing. And I sent these beautiful messages. I was like, look, I love you, I know you're going through a hard time, I really want to speak with, no, zilch, nada, done. And it really brought it back up for me. I was like, wow, this is bringing up, you know, when something happens and it reminds you of some work you did a long ass time ago about some shit that you haven't experienced for ages, but it comes around again and you're like, oh my gosh, the memories of that, fuck, that is just horrible. And I went into this shame spiral and this questioning of my worth and this feeling that, like, God, I don't know anybody at all. Who's going to be the next person that's going to treat me this way? Who, like, I was questioning all of my way of assessing any friendship ever. It's you know, it's quite a time when you get reminded of something, when it comes back around again in a different form. I know I've brought this up before when I've talked about shadow work a few times on the channel, but I want to mention that another thing that I do struggle with, that I've had big shadow work times with, is money. And I would say that overall that is the main thing that has come up the most times in my shadow work that I keep needing to go back to and I keep needing to address because of old stories I tell myself, because of family attitudes towards money and how much money was available, because of just identity in relation to money, class in relation to money, hedonism in relation to money. So I won't go into that because it's a whole big other video on its own, but money has definitely been, my relationship with money has definitely been something that has been on the shadow work altar of examination a few different times. Just definitely wanting to feel more secure with money whilst making some irresponsible decisions with it. Spending money as a painkiller, definitely dealt with overspending in the past and spending on things I did not need. Feeling a lack of control around money, but also not wanting money to define me or control me. So yeah, just old stories about what I can achieve financially, what I deserve to achieve, blah, 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 blah. I've done a lot of work in that area. I'm very proud of myself. I've done a lot of things. There's been a lot of progress, but there could definitely also be more. So that's another area that I have experienced definite difficulties with. And with that, it's like the hamster wheel thing again, where I have felt frustrated with myself. That's mainly the issue I have when I'm shadow working money stuff, is I get so annoyed with my motherfucking self. I'm just like, why can't I do this? Why can't I get to the other side of this? What is it? But I just keep going back to the journaling. I go back to the ritual. I do the mirror work. I do all the things that are useful for me with shadow. I map the shadow. So I map my whole shadow terrain with money. And I'm like, okay, here's this issue over here. Here's this scenario that occurred over here. Here's the shame I feel. Here's the anger I feel. Here, like, and I map it out and I just look at it and I go, okay, what am I not seeing? Where do I need to go deeper? What is it that I could try that would take me out of my comfort zone so I'm not always doing the same thing perpetually? So I just keep going with it. And it's not something that I do sort of over and over again non-stop without end at all. It's something that what's the word? What am I looking for here? It's something that I just keep, I notice is a recurring theme. You know, you have recurring themes with your shadow work. We all do. Things that are really stubborn stains in the shadow. And money is one for me for definite. Do you know what I fucking hate? This is something that's really difficult for me personally. And it's okay. It's fine. It's not a sticking point. It's not like I can't do shadow work because of this, or I'm just going to turn into a massive fire-breathing ogre because of this. It's fine, but it's annoying as fuck. What gets annoying is the times where you're doing a lot of shadow work around something that's happened in your connection with somebody, whether you're still speaking with them and you're going through the issues together, you're talking about the issues together, or whether the connection is over, you're not speaking, or you're not speaking for a while, whatever it is. And you're doing major shadow work. You're doing the journaling, you're doing the ritual, you're doing the readings, you're going to have readings, you're talking about it in therapy, whatever you might be doing. And you know that the other person is not doing any of that at all. Whew, that just, that has gotten to me quite a few times. And yes, you might be listening to me and thinking, well, Kellyanne, that's a judgment. You don't get to say if the other person's not doing anything. But I'm talking about those times where you're trying to figure out where you went wrong, what you could have done better, what is your responsibility, because shadow work is really all about you. Even earlier when I was explaining about my ex-friend and her terrible behaviour, you know, objectively terrible behaviour, I wasn't shadow working her terrible behaviour. I know what her terrible behaviour was. I was trying to bring it back to me and think about, what does this mean about me? What does it not mean about me? What do I need to learn from this? What might I have done wrong that I could have done differently? All those things. And I've always been like that with shadow work, you know, it's about what is going on with me. But I'm talking about when you're doing the work, you're trying to figure out what's what with you, but you know that the other person won't even take any accountability for any wrongdoing whatsoever. They will not say sorry. They think the problem is entirely yours. They think a lot of problems are other people's problems. Sometimes that's actually really the case, where you know the other person isn't going to do fuck all shadow work because they really largely never do. They don't really seem to reflect upon what they might have been able to do differently or what was their issue. Sometimes that's the case anyway. Sometimes it's just specific to whatever is going on between the two of you. But I find that to be a very tough pill to swallow sometimes, is when I'm just doing a lot of work, you know? I'm doing a lot, like I think sometimes I have thought a few times about this major connection in my life in the last few years, that I have shadow worked a lot, and I've done a lot of writing over it, and I've done a lot of sitting with it and praying over it, and like really deeply going into what the fuck happened there. Let me look at it. Let me understand. Let me excavate and learn what happened so this doesn't happen again. And I've done all this work, and a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, chickens, I have sat there and thought, and the other person's not doing anything. They're sticking largely to their ways. They don't really, they're not sitting there smashing out 6 pages in a journal. But you can't afford to think like that. And I laugh at myself when I think like that, and I'm like, you know what, you're not doing it for them, you're doing it for you. And it's not about them, Kellyanne, it's about you. Let's bring it back to self, as you guys know I so often like to say. One of the worst feelings for me is when I know that something is looming. So something has reached consciousness for me that I know is a shadow. It's looming. I know it needs to be, I know that thread needs to be pulled out. I know the work needs to be done, but I'm ignoring it. I'm avoiding it and pretending it's not there. And I'm conscious of that. I'm conscious of the fact that I'm in denial. I'm conscious of the fact that I need to do the work and I'm not doing it. But I can't yet bring myself to the point where I put it on the table and I say, okay, you know what? I'm doing it. Let's do this. I've experienced that, and I know I'm going to get there in the end. I know I'm going to get to the point where I'm like, okay, you know what? I've had this thing. It's in shadow. I keep seeing it. I keep feeling it. I keep knowing it's there. I don't know the extent of it or the real shape of it, but I need to get it out. I know that point's going to come, but if I'm not there yet and I'm still like, I don't know what you mean, I know what you're talking about, that's horrible. That's one of the worst fucking things. And I get myself into a state by the end from the avoidance. I get really like hyperactive and mega productive because I want to avoid, and then I get too tired and overworked, or I get really, really distracted. I could be interested in doing pretty much anything else other than focusing on this thing I know I need to address. I can get very anxious. I can actually experience like things like communication anxiety, for example, or misuse of the imagination in various ways, knowing that actually all I need to do is say to myself, I have a piece of shadow content that I am rolling around in the back of my brain like a marble, and I just need to pull it out, and I just need to accept it's there. That can be one of the most difficult things, is when you know the shadow work is imminent and it absolutely must be done, but you're just not at that point yet. All right, darlings, I think that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for coming on this exploration with me of some of the things about shadow work that I find to be the most difficult things. And one thing that I've learned from doing this video that's been interesting is I do a lot of examination upon myself in shadow work in relation to what is coming up for me that I need to be honest about. What is coming up that is a bad behavior on my part? When I say bad behavior, I'm not trying to be super judgmental towards myself, but I mean, you know, objectively, what could I have done better? What was just not my finest fucking hour, right? And actually that stuff is the meat and potatoes of shadow work a lot of the time for me. And I don't find that to be the most difficult thing. It's hard. It sometimes does suck. And sometimes I have to X out and say, I can't do this, it's too much. And then I come back later and I do it later. But actually what I've realized is that's not the most difficult thing. Sort of trying to take accountability and trying to understand where I could do better isn't the most difficult thing, which I find pleasant to recognize. The other thing I want to say before I end things today, chickens, is I am aware that earlier in this video, when I talked about that ex-friend of mine who starved her cat and stole money from me, I obviously described her behavior as shitty behavior, but I actually put her addictive, out of control drug use under the same umbrella of like shitty behavior, whatever. I just want to say I do see a definite distinction between the relationship she had with her drug of choice that was getting out of control, and I was living around it all the time, and the denial of how bad it was getting, and the stuff she did with the animal neglect and the stealing of the money and that kind of stuff. They are separate, but the reason I mentioned the drug use is because the drug use, I believe, was fueling a lot of the other stuff. I do not demonize drugs in any way. I have a very long-standing and highly colourful relationship with lots of different types of drugs myself, and I do not want to come off like I have an issue with the use of substances, recreationally, spiritually, or otherwise. I think that it's the case sometimes that people with any relationship with any kind of substance, whether it's legal or illegal, will have to take a look at what is going on there and ask themselves some questions. Sometimes the moment comes where it's gotten out of all control, and your behavior as a result of that really might not be your finest behavior, and really might not be you operating as the highest and best version of yourself, and you might be hurting other people because of that. But I wanted to make the point that I was associating the addictive, very heavy use type of pattern with the other behaviors that occurred, and with the fact that I was living around it, and there was just like, it wasn't a great living environment. I was not trying to say that the drug use itself is bad behavior on its own. I do not believe that. So I just wanted to put that out there if it sounded like I was coming off as judgy about drug use. Believe me, I've definitely been to tea with the Mad Hatter and the March Hare, and I'm in no position to judge drug use in that way, nor would I want to. But I just wanted to make the point that that is why I mentioned the out of control addictive pattern of drug use that she was in denial about, and I linked it to the other bad behaviors, or I'm doing it again, the negative disruptive behaviors I think were fueled by just how much she was taking this drug. So I wanted to just put that across. Please do not think that I'm going all weird on people about, all that shit, because I'm not. I just it was all part of the same thing, and I think it can get out of control sometimes, and you just need to have a word with yourself, and she was not doing that. So I wanted to put that across. Please do not think I was trying to be judgmental, or that I would be judgmental if somebody had an addiction to any drug. I would not at all. So yeah. So with all of that being said, darlings, this is it. I'm going to wrap it up now. Again, thank you for coming on the journey with me. And if you are a patron of mine in the Doll Faces or Pop-Tarts tier, there is an Afterthoughts episode coming to you very shortly where I will expand more on some of the things that I have learned about doing shadow work healthily, and some of the things that I would say would make shadow work less difficult. So I want to talk about some of those things in the Afterthoughts episode. If you would like to get your hands on my Afterthoughts video series, and if you would also like to come and chat on the Discord, get involved in our movie nights that we have, and enjoy the one card riff every month and other benefits as well, please go down and check out the Patreon options. Join me on social media. I'm very active on Instagram. I'm active on Facebook. Come and join me on Twitter. Come and join me on TikTok now, if you can believe that. I will put it all down below. And until next time, darlings, much love, and as always, blessed be.